Without getting into much details, let's recap this story. Jonah was swallowed by a whale. He spends 3 days in its belly, and then the whale kind of spits him out. The plot is not specifically Christian, for it is found in the Old Testament and pertains to Judaism as well. However, as you know, Christian theologians always considered the Old Testament to be a precursor to the New Testament. And in fact, that tradition was predicated by a saying of Christ himself. Remember, in one of the Gospels he says, "Just like Jonah has spent 3 days in the abyss of a whale's belly and then was released, so will the Son of Man die, and spend 3 days in a grave and then will resurrect." So, you see what he did here? He established a connection between the event from the Old Testament and the event from a New Testament. It's an allegorical connection. There is a parallel, a link of meanings. So that was setting an example. And in later periods, Christian philosophers and theologians spent a lot of mental energy trying to find similar connections, similar links between the Old and the New Testaments. In fact, we'll spend much time on it later, so stay tuned for that. But for now, let me give you a few more examples of rare plots and rare storylines which you can encounter in catacombs. The first story, well, it's not even a story, it's more of a visual image, and it is perhaps the most specific to early Christian art, and it is the Good Shepherd. In the Gospel of John, Christ says, "I am the Good Shepherd." The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And this image, a shepherd who takes care of his flock, has gained huge popularity. As for reasons, I would name two. First, it is easy to visualize. Good Shepherd is not an abstract idea. On the contrary, it is very tangible, very concrete, and because of that, very appealing. Secondly, people of that time were, generally speaking, familiar with agriculture, and the idea of a sheep or a lamb that requires care and protection must have been absolutely clear to them. Images of the Good Shepherd survived in dozens. They are usually quite similar, although with variations. For example, here he has some kind of a bucket in his hands, and also surrounded by birds that are sitting on a tree around him. Now, some images are more skillfully executed than others, well, some are quite clumsy, like this one. A good shepherd is in most cases represented as a young man who carries lamb on his shoulders. What is unique about this type of iconography is that in addition to numerous frescoes, there are also sculptures depicting the Good Shepherd, which is not so common. You see, full-scale marble sculptures were obviously expensive, which is why the amount of early Christian sculptures is meager. However, there is a famous one now in the Vatican. Here it is, and it is famous for two reasons: its high quality and how well it is preserved. See for yourself, the finesse of this sculpture matches the most outstanding examples of antique art. Don't you agree? Well, and here is the less famous one. Although the sculptor was obviously less skillful, he followed the same artistic tradition. And it is important, to notice that this tradition is substantially older than you might think. For this motif, specifically Christian, nevertheless had an antique prototype. This image, a man with a lamb on his shoulders, is encountered in ancient art constantly. The earliest example probably dates back to the 6th century BC. Here it is. This particular type of male sculpture is usually referred to as kouros, which is simply Greek for a young man. They were mostly produced in the Archaic period, that is to say between the 8th and the 6th centuries BC, at the dawn of antique civilization. Therefore, they might seem tentative and primitive. Anatomy is merely outlined. Gestures are either absent or clumsy and unnatural. But it is in this period that the first attempts to convey movement were made. Usually those choruses have one foot in front of the other, as if taking a step forward. But in this case, young male does more than simply walking. He's carrying a calf on his shoulders, apparently for sacrifice. And again, for people who fed themselves by raising cattle, such image was familiar and appealing. Hence the tenaciousness of this motif. There is a very famous sculpture of a much later period representing a young satyr or faun, half man and half god. And he also carries a lamb on his shoulders. That's how he looks like. But what might really surprise you is the fact that Christian artists, without hesitation, have appropriated this motif, although pagan in nature. Moreover, not only they copied the main element, a calf that lies on shepherd's shoulders, but also some artistic solutions firmly associated with Greek and effectively pagan sculptors. Now, what am I talking about? Let's take a closer look at the sculpture of the Good Shepherd once again. Notice that absolutely classical antique contrapost is used here. And what is contrapost, you might ask? Oh, that would be one of the most tenacious inventions of Greek sculptors. Simply put, it's a way of positioning a figure, a way that makes a sculpture vivid and animated. The trick is mostly in weight distribution. Okay, here is what it looks like. One leg is supporting the weight of the body, the whole body, while the other leg is relaxed and slightly bent. Shoulders are also positioned unevenly, but in reverse. Shoulder above the supporting leg is lower. Looks like this. Hence the name of this position. The opposite body parts are contrasted. While the hip above the supporting leg is slightly higher, the shoulder on the same side is lower. Well, that does not seem like such a great breakthrough, you might say. But it was indeed a breakthrough. Because what such position accomplishes is a sense of natural anatomical connection of all limbs of the body. Remember those archaic sculptures, those cuirasses? Their arms and legs seemed isolated. While legs were performing their task, which was making a step forward, arms remained perfectly still, which looks robotic and unnatural, like this. That is not how a human body functions, not at all. Our body is integrated, which is a fancy way of saying that all its parts are connected and participate in getting the job done, even if the job is simple. You slightly wave your hands while walking, don't you? And when standing, you fidget a little, constantly adjusting your position, resting your legs in turn, like this. And that sublime yet uninterrupted activity is precisely the difference between a living organism and a sculpture. Now, Greek sculptors cracked that code very early, and thanks to them, contrapost became an essential part of the antique artistic arsenal. So Christians took those ancient solutions and adapted them for their own purposes. To this fact, I will be drawing your attention constantly, because it is very important for us to understand that although Christian art was of course new in terms of its content, but in terms of its technique, it was a rightful heir of the ancient art. Yes, eventually Christian and pagan art split ways, but that didn't happen overnight. When and under what circumstances it finally did happen, That is an interesting question in itself, which we will discuss, but a little later. What is important for us now is the fact that originally there was no dividing line between Christian and pagan art. There was no repulsion on the part of Christians, no prohibition of pagan technique, no condemnation of seemingly pagan images. Contrary to what you have expected, early Christian artists relied heavily on achievements of their pagan predecessors. Now, one more interesting point about the image of Good Shepherd. In the Middle Ages, it was almost completely eradicated. The latest examples of this motif date back to probably the 4th century, after which it was forgotten. Why? Well, that is another good question. Maybe it was because this image had too many pagan connotations. After all, its pagan prototype is quite obvious. Another possible explanation might be that after Christianity was established as the official religion in Rome, the very idea of representing Christ as the Good Shepherd became unfitting and unnecessary. I have already said that Christians use symbols in order to visualize the invisible. Hence the images of fish or charisma as substitute for Christ. However, it is exactly in this case that such image seems unnecessary. After all, Christ was a God and a man, which is the whole point of Christianity. Moreover, Christ had a completely recognizable appearance, and it was possible to depict him quite clearly without having to employ any kind of symbolism. But then again, don't forget about persecutions of Christians during the first 3 centuries of Christianity's existence. It's easy to imagine how they could attempt to avoid demonstrating Christ in order to throw the investigators off, or in order to avert his image being desecrated. Maybe, under those circumstances, the Good Shepherd was more relevant. But after Constantine, when Christianity began to be professed openly, there was no need to conceal Christ anymore, and eventually the Good Shepherd was discarded. In any case, this image remained characteristic of early Christian art only. Okay, let's move on. The second subject, especially favored by early Christian artists, is Jonah in the belly of a whale. Do you remember the story? The Lord commands Jonah to go to the city called, I hope I can get it right on the first try, called Nineveh. Yes! Now, the city is steeped in lust and vices, and so it's Jonah's job to inform its citizens that they soon will be punished for their sinful lifestyle. Jonah isn't particularly excited about this perspective, for he realizes that inhabitants of Nineveh will probably take his message unkindly. So, instead he gets on a ship and sails in the opposite direction. But God renders a storm, and when the sailors begin to talk about the fact that probably the storm was sent to them for the sins of someone on the ship, and someone needs to be thrown overboard, Jonah volunteers for this. And as he is thrown overboard, the sea immediately calms. As for Jonah, he is swallowed by a whale, which is of course a loose translation of a term from a Bible meaning a giant fish. Plain and simple.